All right, it's 12 o'clock. We'll go ahead and begin the presentation. Thank you for joining us if you're on Zoom or on Facebook Live. Today we have our presentation. It's a part of the Diné government presentation series. Just a quick background, we are part of the Commission on Navajo Government Development. We have a 12-person commission that includes 5 agency representatives, 3 branches of the government, also a practitioner of Native Healing Arts, a Diné college student, and even a HES graduate student. So we hope that they're part of our office. And so when we say government development, there's a component of commission and office. And so today, I'm part of the Office of Navajo Government Development. We have our Executive Director, Harrison Sosi, our other policy analyst, Tristan Black, Wanda Nelson, our Senior Office Specialist, and Mariah Stanley. So a relatively small team, but we're really glad to be here today. We actually want to start off today with an icebreaker question. So the icebreaker, we're going to use the chat feature. So no Google search, so no looking it up. But our main question is, what was the first chapter? And then if you're such a government expert, what year was the first chapter formed? So you can use the chat feature on Zoom. You can also use the Facebook Live comment section to put your answers. We gained the first question, some responses. The second question is a little more challenging, but we hope by the end of this presentation, we'll have the answer covered pretty well. So I'll give you guys 30 seconds to put anything in the chat. We have another answer for the second one. Very close, very close. Just continue to use the chat and Facebook Live feature. So again, thank you for being here, and we will begin momentarily. I'll give you guys another 15 seconds, and then we will dive into our presentation. Okay, so the first chapter was Loop chapter, and it was actually in 1927. And so we had a couple of close guesses. We'll discuss this more in the presentation, but just kind of give you an idea of where we're going to be going in terms of our conversation. So Yakte, everyone, this is the Diné governance, 1923 to present. So over 100 years of government history. Again, I'm a policy analyst here with the Office of Navajo Government Development, and very glad to be here. She tohan nishle, tapaha bashichin, tapaha dashiche, ado ashin dashinale, aside de nasha. And I'm really glad to be here, coming in from Window Rock. Our office is in Window Rock, Arizona. My current role is as a policy analyst with the office, but in my previous roles, I was working at the office, White House Office of Management and Budget as a confidential assistant. Before that, I was on the Arizona Democratic Party Mission for Arizona, digital organizing associate, working virtually, working through Zoom. But even before that, I was a Utah State University Upward Bound program counselor and literature teacher, which is a pretty difficult job working with high schoolers and correcting their grammar. But prior to that, I spent my college at Harvard College. I did my Bachelor of Arts in Social Studies there. And that's where a lot of my love for history comes. But really, it started at Navajo Prep. So I was class of 2013. I'm really proud of our current athletics, but even our debate team. They went to state too. Just want to acknowledge them too. And so really proud of just the accomplishments at Navajo Prep, and as an alum, really glad to came from there. So we only have an hour. We scheduled an hour. Hopefully everyone's eating lunch or having something to eat or drink. But this presentation is going to cover a lot. And our Diné governance timeline, it really starts with unwritten traditional governance. And we talk about Ashkedan, talking about creation stories, talking about traditional governance structures. And we're not going to be discussing that today as much. We're going to reference it But that's where my great coworker, Tristan Black, policy analyst, who's covering the chat, he did a whole traditional governance seminar last week. It's a 1 month, really, or one last week, 1 hour, great presentation. And so we highly recommend that. That's on our YouTube. I believe Tristan will put it on our chat. And so you can watch this after our presentation today. Don't jump off right now. And so the idea is we want this really foundational traditional governance and talking about how we used to operate before and currently what our current government has formed from today. And so it's a lot of conversation, but we thought that's a great segue to this current presentation. So in terms of us talking today, we do have to reference U.S. federal Indian policy. So we're not going to go too much into this. Again, Mr. Sosi, our director, gave a great presentation on our YouTube. Great plug there. And we're trying to really develop these videos so it can be educational for individuals. And he covers it pre-treaty all the way to up to the treaty, and a lot of great stories and Supreme Court cases and really historical policies. I'll just do light references in my presentation today, but we're really having these conversations of the U.S. and Navajo being understanding the U.S. federal Indian policy. So we have a coexistence period. This is where a lot of the U.S. said we'll be able to coexist with tribes. We'll be able to, have our own area and then be separate. And so this doesn't go that long in terms of history. It goes right into a removal policy in terms of you have not only the Navajo Long Walk, but you have the Cherokee Trail of Tears. You have a lot of forced removal of tribes east of the Mississippi River. And this is where you start to see the Indian territory, as known as Oklahoma, start to be drafted and created. And this is where you start to see that removal period. And we won't discuss too much into that, but it's really great to understand the U.S. federal Indian policy and how it relates to us here on Navajo. And it always plays a role in history. And me, I love history. I think there's a lot of great stories and narratives. And so when we talk about this, we got to go back in time. We got to imagine ourselves at these critical points, before phones, before TV, and to think about how our ancestors were dealing with these certain policies and certain histories. So that's just the context we want to do. And this will be, you'll see there's a theme going on that you'll see these timelines start to evolve. I wanted to make this presentation as visual as possible and there's a lot of information. We won't be diving so much into so many things. Again, we have an hour and want to give some time to think about it. But we talk about the treaty era, and it's always important to talk about this because it's really, when you understand what a treaty represents, it's a relationship between two sovereigns. And so the first Navajo treaty with the United States, there's other treaties with the Mexicans and the Spanish. We won't be talking about that today, but really that first treaty was signed. There was a lot of issues in terms of certain leaders representing certain areas, but not representing all Navajos. And so there was some broken treaties on both sides in terms of certain individuals not knowing. And there's a lot of great literature on that. But one of the big things after that first treaty signing is a traditional ceremony. This Chit, this concept that was talked about in the traditional governance. And so this was a gathering of Navajo leadership, Navajo headmen, war chiefs, and peace chiefs, and they performed this ceremony for leadership and strength. And the last one that we can find record or reference of was near Chinle in 1858. And so that's that traditional governance. And so being mindful of that, in 1863, just a couple of years later, Navajos were rounded up by Kit Carson and sent to Fort Sumner. And this is where we had the Navajo Long Walk. And so, I'm not going to go too much into this era, but this is really critical to understand that. And this led right to the Treaty of 1868, a couple of years later. And that treaty is really significant because it plays a role in what we do today and in terms of having a sovereign government. And this is where you get that analogy, a nation within a nation. And so as an Indian nation, we have certain legal opportunities and certain legal standing that is held highly. And our director does a really great job covering this in other presentations. But really, it's this U.S. Navajo trust relationship was established during this time, post-treaty, where the Navajos said, okay, or the U.S. saying, Navajos, you guys can go back to your reservation. The concept of a reservation was created. And this is where we start to see that relationship, and where Washington, as Navajos represented, is going to be over here. And Navajos are going to kind of do their own thing, but they're going to have these agents for the Indians of Navajo Agency. So these agents or these Bureau of Indian Affairs are in the Navajo community. They're representing Washington to the Navajos, telling Navajos, you can do this, you can do that. And this relationship's really interesting because it talks, when you start talking about governance, the BIA was already playing a role in this, and we'll kind of discuss this then. But after this post-treaty era, I find it really fascinating because you find yourself without a formal government. You find yourself, and in 1872, a couple of years after the Treaty of 1868, you see the development of the Navajo Nation Police Force. So these were 100 Navajo men led by Chief Manlito to kind of represent a law and order within the community. And this is BIA kind of hosting this police force, so making sure that there's no huge Wild West fights. I always imagine my grandfather watching Gunsmoke, and making sure that the Navajos don't go have these crazy rebellions and whatnot. And this is a really first attempt at kind of a type of governance. And so 1883, a couple decade later, we see an actual council meeting, the first chief council meeting. Again, there's no chapters, there's no president, there are these certain chief leaders, and this is led by Chief Manlito. And this meeting was a really first meeting, and they talked about education, they talked about acquiring more tools and land, and they're marking reservation boundaries. So again, this is coming after the Treaty of 1868. Imagine that horrific event and the eventual return to the homelands, Diné, and they're talking about, okay, how are we going to govern? How are we going to do this? And there's already still those traditional leadership there, but they also have to kind of work with Washington, D.C. Again, there's that relationship. And so over 2,500 Navajos attend this meeting. So it's a really demand event. People want to go and learn about the education and these certain things that are introduced to the Navajo people. Again, we're in 1883. We're not in 1980s or whatnot. We're really during this time where Navajos are coming into this relationship. And in 1884, a U.S. agent, United States BIA agent, declares Henry Chi Dodge as head chief of Navajo tribe. And so not really saying, oh, these older chiefs should be in charge. We're going to kind of pick this one leader. And this is a big theme, the U.S. saying, we're not going to kind of follow what Navajos do. We're going to choose, and we're going to appoint certain people. And so this kind of came with older leadership. Again, 1868 to 1884 is approximately 20 years. So there are some leaders who are older and whatnot. So again, imagine we're back in time. And this is how the reservation looks. This is 1920s. And the Navajo Nation does not look how it is today. And you start to see certain themes within this. And there's actually 6 Navajo agencies at this point. And they were created for the BIA to have certain agents out there to be able to talk and to represent the U.S. to the Navajos. And so these weren't created by Navajos. These were created by BIA to kind of, okay, we'll have certain individuals out here, certain outposts, maybe enlarge with a certain fort. And so there's resources at these certain areas. And so this is the establishment of this. And Hopi's not separate at this point. This is really mindful. So again, we got to take ourselves out of our current situation and think 1920s Navajo. And so in 1921, a Council of San Juan Agency Navajos, which is kind of that northern New Mexico, northwest Arizona, right here in San Juan, they granted a company oil lease in Hogback, New Mexico. The oil wells are kind of there to represent that. And they discover oil. And it was meant to be kind of explore the area, but they found oil and gas. But there's a question of like, how do we do a lease? How do we do approvals? And so this starts a whole conversation. And the U.S. Department of Interior comes in and determines that, hey, these local councils can't decide these leases. We got to go look back at the Treaty of 1868. Again, referencing a treaty that was just signed 40 years ago. And this treaty stipulates a council of 3/4 of all adult Navajo males to agree to this. So require a huge vote just for one lease. Imagine that, right? So when you talk oil leases, and oh man, like 1921, there's opportunities, and but it would require a whole election, and 3/4 of all Navajos need to approve it, of males, not just 50% plus one, but 3/4. That's a lot of people to agree to this one lease. Well, the Department of Interior determines that, hey, no. First off, the agency council can't get all the benefits. It has to go to all Navajos. So even though one oil lease and mineral lease is in one community, it belongs to the whole tribe, not just those in the area. And that's still kind of held to this day. That's a bigger conversation in terms of talking about minerals and whatnot. But then, so this conversation continues. And so Department of Interior, the US government, instructed the Commissioner of Indian Affairs to set up a representative group to sign all oil leases for the tribe. Okay, so that kind of is the establishment of this business council. So it's called the Navajo Business Council. In 1922, there were 3 individuals, all handpicked by the BIA, and they were given the power to arrange these leases for the tribe. And so that was given to them by the BIA commissioner, not the Navajo people. They're not included, but the BIA saying, hey, this is how you sign oil leases. We're going to select you 3 individuals, Chi Dodge, Charlie Mitchell, and Dougal Chi. And you guys are going to be the first business council. And so a lot of questions kind of raised from that. And the first time getting ahead of myself. But anyways, Burke is also developing this plan. He says, we should have a special commissioner. We should have 6 reservation agencies, and we'll have 2 delegates from each one. And that's kind of like the formation of the business council shortly. And but the first tribal council meeting was held on July 7th, 1923 at Totolina, New Mexico, or Two Gray Hills, and where the X is. And so this is really a historic moment, right? As you can, if you drove around the Capitol this past year, you'll see the 100th centennial. In the Summer Council, Navajo Nation Council, they reference this 100-year history. So really, this is the historic moment. It's July 7th to now. It's been over 100 years with the Tribal Council. And so that's really a historic moment. When you talk about centennial, when you talk about the history of our government, this is really where it was established. And then, like we mentioned, it started with 3 and eventually went to 12 and eventually goes to 24. But eventually they elect Chi Dodge as the chairman. And so this isn't the Navajo people choosing, it's a council. It's that 12-person council selecting Chi Dodge. And so right away, the first resolution is to give all the authority of that council back to the BIA and to give them the authority to sign all future oil and gas leases. So I did a little bit more research, and what's really fascinating is you start to see the BIA kind of negotiating with Navajos. Like, hey, even though it's not in clear terms, there's a reference that if you give us this authority to sign these oil and gas leases, we might be able to find a way to give you more land. And it wasn't a direct quote, but it gave that initiative and motion that, hey, there's more lands. As you can tell, there's lands that are part of the Navajo Nation now that aren't included in this 1920 map. And so that's really important because you start to see the BIA kind of say, hey, playing with leadership and saying, we'll do this if you do this. And so that's kind of tied to this first resolution of the tribe, which is to give the BIA the ability to do the oil and gas leases, which is significant. So we have to go back to this timeline. We'll continue with this timeline. And again, we started with unwritten, and then we had this development of this council. It just kind of visualized, and we'll start going through time. And so 1923, over 100 years ago, 101 years now, is significant. So I want you to put in the chat, and all of this that we talked about, thinking about how the Navajo Nation government started. What are your thoughts? What are you thinking? And, it doesn't have to be like a perfect thought. It doesn't have to, what are you feeling too, this is a creation of our government 101 years ago and how it was started. It wasn't started because Navajos gathered together. It was kind of a BIA telling Navajos, you need to sign these oil leases. This is the only way it's going to happen, in some ways it's kind of maybe going around some obstacles, going around an election. So you start to see that, and you can put it in the chat. It doesn't have to be right now, but just start thinking about this, thinking about how our government was created. And so again, this presentation, we're not going to go into all the history of the Navajo Nation. We're going to start talking about how these certain things we see today are started. And we start off with council. That's the biggest one right now. So I know some of you might be shy, but feel free to put in the chat. And so see what other people are thinking. But I'll continue on. So we start talking about citizenship and chapters. And so this isn't Navajo people saying we want to be US citizens. In fact, it's like 1924, the US Indian Citizenship Act was passed by the US government. And it's saying, these natives are going to become US citizens without their input as much. Maybe some wanted to be citizens, some may not. Again, it's kind of this imposed governance of saying, all right, not only Navajos, but natives overall, you will become citizens. And this is 1924, so 100 years ago. And so this summer, it was passed, I believe, in June. It's a really historic moment, in terms of 100 years of citizenship. And what does that mean for individuals? And so right during this time, too, just to imagine, you have this concept of a chapter be created in Loop chapter, those people that answered. And it was created by the USBIA agency as a superintendent, John G. Hunter. And he had a really interesting life. I was doing some research in his in this, and he kind of went to different reservations, kind of saw how different reservations were acting differently. But the concept is basically that not only do it doesn't follow the traditional, like there's one leader for all these people, but Hunter saw them kind of like gathering naturally already. And he said, he's going to propose a New England town meeting style, which is like what we kind of imagine now as a chapter meeting. It's like having a certain leader. They called it the chief back then, but now it's the president. They actually had a vice chief, which is the vice president. And then they had a secretary that becomes the secretary treasurer today. And so this is the interesting note is they didn't meet monthly. They didn't meet, they probably met more quarterly. They met 4 to 5 times a year to discuss certain issues in the community. And so Loop chapter became this model. And so John G. Hunter, like, wow, this is really working. And Navajos really loved it. Navajos really loved it. And so he started in the Loop agency. As you can saw, there was different agencies at the time. Then he was sent to South Navajo agency, which is actually Fort Defiance agency today. And and then in just 5 or 8 years later, or 7 years later, there was 500 chapter houses were established, which is amazing. And I was trying to find the information for this. And what's fascinating is these chapter houses just grow so much. People love them. People love the idea that, hey, we can be in this our own clan and our own system right here. We don't have to go to Window Rock. And back in 1920s and 30s, imagine traveling all the way to Window Rock to get a signature or do something. But this was kind of like chapter houses were a real big hit. It doesn't grow from there. It actually declines heavily because funding got limited in the 30s. And there's a lot of research to be done there. It's not, it's just a lot of information. So I'm going to keep it as high level as I can and not go too much. Again, thank you for putting in the chat your thoughts, and that's really helpful. And share your thoughts with people. I think that's really great. And so, but anyways, chapters are a big hit. That's the biggest thing, and people are really loving it. Navajo people specifically. In terms of federal Indian policy, we shift from this removal to this assimilation. So when you think of it, assimilation, you're thinking the U.S. wants to, make natives become part of the society. They want them to become American. Stop being native, you become American. And that's where you kind of get the idea of kill the Indian, save the man, and those concepts. And that's a lot with boarding schools and this era. There's so much to cover, but just imagine all these different things that federal Indian law is telling, like, all right, we're going to do this at this level now. And that's where we have this conversation. In terms of our governance timeline, we have chapters are created, so council was created, and just 4 years later it was chapters. So, when you think of the historical timeline, that's the first thing was council and then chapters. And so one of the things that we're talking about is agency jurisdictions. So this is like the 6 agencies or 5 agencies including Hopi. And so this is where you start to see, okay, there's going to be 2 delegates for council from all of these agencies, and they're going to represent those agencies. And that language still exists today. This is established by BIA to kind of have a better way to work within Navajos, because Navajo is very large. Other tribes, they said, oh, we only need 1 or maybe 2 commissioners, but Navajo is so large, we need several agents out there. And we still have this to this day. We have the modern sub-agencies that are created in 1955. So that includes Chinle, Fort Defiance, Crown Point, Shiprock, Tuba City, but really goes all the way back to 1927. And this isn't really a direct Navajo creation. This is really created from BIA, as a way to work with Navajos, as a way to kind of have their role in there. So again, you got to be mindful that these things were created with certain intentions, with certain thought and certain history. And that kind of shifts into voting and livestock. So Thomas Dodge was appointed chairman in 1932. Again, before this, Navajo people weren't voting for these leaders, for chairmen or council. They were appointed. And so Thomas Dodge is like recommending we should allow the people to vote. We should allow them to be a democracy, democratic voting. And so, but the next year, John Collier, who's a famous name, was appointed Commissioner of Indian Affairs. And he starts to discuss these livestock reductions and reorganization. So these are big terms, coming out. And this is kind of like a turn of the policy during that time. It's not just, okay, we're going to start assimilating them. We're going to start reorganizing them. We're going to start reorganizing how these tribes are working, and there's already a council, but we're going to start reorganizing how they are. And this is where you start to hear all of this. And just imagine, you're a Navajo and you're like, okay, what is our leadership? We're not voting yet. There's a recommendation to come start voting. And then the tribal council chamber is created. It was actually created 1934 to 1935. So this is during that same time. Imagine people driving to these council meetings, gathering, no Zoom during that time, of course. But they were gathering, they were talking about all of these important things happening to them, the livestock reduction, where large amounts of animals were basically killed off. And so people went to their local chapter and complained and argued they shouldn't be having this. And so, and then during this point, John Collier is representing this and saying, all right, tribes, and he wants Navajo to become an Indian Reorganization Act tribe. So they create this boilerplate constitution, tribal council, this is how you're going to be. And so Navajo people, understanding this vote, they start hearing about it, and it's a close election, as the numbers say, it's a 308 for vote difference. And people are scared about it. They don't want to follow the US, they just had all these animals killed off, and so it kind of relates to this. And the US is kind of playing this role of like, hey, there's this, we know better, overgrazing and etc. But also there's the Navajo saying, hey, you're also going to say we can't expand our reservation now. So enters this conversation. There's actually a clear opposition from Delegate J.C. Morgan, white traders, and Protestant missionaries. That's a pretty interesting historic note. So you start to think, okay, I know why Navajos are fearful, but why are these individuals fearful of this constitution? And the answers are the traders or these original traders feared that their trading posts would be replaced by these tribally owned co-ops, that they couldn't charge and make a lot of profit from Navajos selling their arts and crafts, or selling their animals. So they feared that once they create this constitution, they'll be kicked out, So that was pretty interesting. The next one was the Protestants. So these Protestant churches were fearful that they would be forced off the reservation. They said, oh, wait, once the Navajos create the constitution, we won't be allowed on the reservation, And so that's really interesting. So there was actually opposition from the white traders and missionaries against any reorganization attempt. So that was really interesting, So there's that attempt, and then there's also Navajos who are like, hey, we can't let the BIA tell us to be a constitution. They just killed all our sheep and do this and that. So in terms of a conversation, there's constitution attempts. So constitution attempts are written attempts to establish a Navajo nation in a certain way. In 1937, there was another attempt following the Reorganization Act in 1935. So just 2 years later, it's kind of drafted or not, it's drafted by the Navajo Council and it's eventually rejected by the Interior Secretary. So BIA has that second authority to say, hey, no, no, no. Even though us Navajos want to go like this, the tribal council, no, the BIA says that's too much. And it actually has some of the language that we still have today, which includes the governing body of the Navajo tribe shall be the Navajo Council. Not the Navajo people, the council is really the governing body. That's a huge key point that's even in this document that still lives today. And the second part is tribal members shall be 1/4 degree of Navajo blood. This is where you start to see these like definitions of membership. And then to approve the sale, disposition, lease, or encumbrance of tribal land. So again, that goes back to council, not to the people. So this is one of the first constitution attempts that is recorded that we know of. And so this is really historic. This kind of enters that conversation, federal Indian law, reorganization. So again, this is really important. And so when we talk about tribal council, we even start to see just a couple years later, council appointed the first rules and regulations adopted for council by Secretary of Interior. I want to really emphasize this point that even though the tribal council is doing these acts, they still got to get approval by Secretary of Interior. The U.S. still plays a huge role, in terms of making sure the Navajos don't go too crazy, or too much independent. And so just the next year, we see the Secretary of Interior approve the rules and governing of the tribal council. And in there is a key word: the tribal council shall be the governing body of the Navajo tribe. Again, not the people, but the council has a lot of authority. They have the authority to sign leases. They have this authority to sign all of these documents. So that's really important. And it still exists like that today. And then through the work of a constitutional convention, they finally elect a tribal chairman. No longer are they selecting from the council, but they're actually having elections during this time. And the elections are still really by BIA kind of saying, all right, we are going to help you guys with the elections. So even that. And so in terms of going back in the big picture, U.S. federal Indian policy, we entered a termination period, just a couple of years after this reorganization period. And so other tribes were losing their federal Indian status, other tribes were facing these big issues during this time. And so in terms of Navajo, you start to see this relationship of the things that the Bureau of Indian Affairs used to do, kind of handing over to Navajos to do. And in 1955, this starts with the election process. Again, before this, any election was done with the BIA kind of having the process. And this is the time where the Navajo says, hey, we can do our own elections. We can go out there to the community and get our own elections. And this is really critical for democracies. And then the next couple years later is the Navajo Tribal Court was established. So this is where BIA used to have this really intense court, and they would have a system. They were really rigid, they were handpicked by the BIA to kind of say, all right, these people I want to be in charge. Again, Navajo's not really in charge. And then now this transfers that from the BIA to the Navajos. And with that, it's a trial court. There's 7 appointed judges. But this still isn't an independent branch. You're still kind of guided a lot by tribal council. Again, we're still one branch government at this time, So when we talk branches, they're just one, And so, and then during this time, we even have the Navajo Nation seal established. So you start to see the formation of the current Navajo Nation government, the current representation, and it was officially adopted in 1952 by resolution. And so you start to see that. So before we had a flag, we had our Navajo Nation seal. And so, and then we entered a second constitution attempt. So this was actually submitted by the tribal council. They said, this is what we want. This is the constitution we want. And again, all these constitution attempts are on our website. There's just one note, the 2016 version, which we'll get to, isn't on there yet. But the other ones, including this one, is on there. And it kind of focuses this like Navajo Hopi Rehabilitation Act. And it develops a constitution for the approval of the people, but the Secretary of Interior still has to approve it. And so even though it kind of came from this concept of, okay, we'll follow these concepts, and a lot of it is very similar to the US and a couple of concepts, but still the solicitor of the United States says, hey, wait, certain provisions are inconsistent with federal new law. So they scrap the whole constitution attempt and they kind of say, okay, we'll start over. So again, this is the second constitution attempt in terms of history. And so, and then a couple years later, in 1968, we actually have the Navajo Nation flag by J. DeGroat, and in 1968. So these are the formation of certain things that we see today in our government. And so in terms of this, we have the courts kind of established, they're not a complete independent branch, but this is where we start to see that judicial branch kind of start to sprout. And that's what we start to see this in terms of governance. And so, and then we enter this current era of self-determination, allowing tribes to represent their own ideas. And so following this federal Indian policy, we start to see the tribes start to do things and reorganize itself, not with the federal US BIA, but during this time in 1968, just a couple of years after that, we see a third constitution attempt. And this one was written and drafted, and it's on our website, but it was never submitted to the Navajo people for their approval. Again, it really replicates the US Constitution a bit, but it came from Raymond Nakai, the current chairman at the time, in his campaign. And he really said Navajo people really need a constitution. And even though the Navajo Tribal Council approved it, it was never really submitted to the people for their vote, and it kind of failed. And a lot of people say, if this goes out to the people, it'll fail. So they didn't even attempt to do that during this time. So these constitution attempts are showing that even though during all these times, people are still hesitant to put these constitution attempts and to think about governance. Maybe it's not the right thing. Maybe, following the US too much. There's a lot of different reasons for this. But that's what is really highlighted. And then in 1985, we have the second branch. This is created after the Judicial Reform Act. And so it creates the Navajo Supreme Court, and it made the courts an independent branch of the government. They're no longer underneath the authority of the tribal council, their own separate branch. And that's when we have this idea of a two-branch system. And so just imagine, a really two-branch tree coming up now, and you're not just having one skinny Charlie Brown Christmas tree. So it's really important, it's really effective in having that independence as a branch. And so this kind of shifts. I mean, just 4 years later, we have a Navajo 1989 riot. And this comes after Chairman McDonald is alleged and really charged with having embezzlement, having a kickback scheme of buying a piece of land, the Big Boquillas Ranch in west of Navajo. And so it's really historic. And we'll kind of talk about this in our future presentations, but this historic riot comes when there's a challenge between the chairman and another faction of the council, and there's an infighting basically. And instead of peaceful mediation, it actually led to violence. There was actual death and violence, and families divided between McDonald and 49 supporters. And we'll kind of discuss this in future presentations a bit more on our next series. But this is a really historic time because we have this challenge of who's the leadership. You have chief or police officers on both sides. You have different people on different sides, and it actually leads to violence. And so because of that, the council and eventually creates this temporary three-branch government. And they said, okay, we're going to take, the chairman has too much power and authority, and we're going to put that chairman from the council into the president and vice president office. And we'll create a three-branch temporary government. And the idea is that we'll have some separation of powers, that the chairman had too much power to make deals and to make certain priorities. And so this is where we start to see that formation of our current government, which is really inspired by a lot of the U.S. ideology, and that the president is going to be voted by the people, but the legislative branch will have the speaker be created, and that will be selected not by the people but by council. And so you kind of start to see the formation of how certain branches are formed. And this is coming from a delegate proposal, CD 6889, which is legislation, and it creates this tribal council. And it actually creates our office at this time. And so this is a really historic time, and it's concerned with the power, separation of powers and checks and balances that prior to this weren't happening, with a one or two branch government. And they said this is the best way to have one branch create the laws, one execute the laws, and one interpret the laws. And it really heavily is inspired by the US. But you start to see that this is an attempt of doing this. And they actually have this conversation, and we actually see the fourth Constitution attempt. So this was actually drafted by an attorney, Lance Russo, and it was supposed to be approved by referendum, but the referendum never materialized. Again, we start to see these documents drafted. This is how we want this for the people, but it never goes further than that usually at this point. In 1989, it covers a lot of things that are already in the document of the current government, and so, but it never goes beyond that. So just to keep this all in mind. And so once we go back to our Diné governance timeline, we start to see this temporary Navajo nation, this three-branch system. They said, the Office and Commission of Navajo Government Development are tasked with this project to create a government that represents the people, that's accountable, And in there's also chapters. Chapters are still in this like really interesting phase. They're not a branch of government, but they're their own entity. There's a whole discussion about this, and again, we have other presentations. I would love to dive into it into future presentations, but again, this is this big timeline to understand and to visualize our government of when it was created. So really, the office of the president, established in 1989, plays a huge role in that. And so in the chat, thank you for everyone who commented. Our next question is, do you think the three-branch government was the right plan? Again, you have to go back in time. Some of you may have been there. Me, I was not born at this time. This is beyond my era, but you start to think, okay, was that the right plan? I know everything's 2020 in hindsight now that we're in our current system, but imagine, you have a certain leader who embezzles funds or has this and this, but you also have a council that says, hey, we're going to get rid of you, and so then there's this infighting, and so the best that they could think about was let's do a three-branch government. That's what's taught in U.S. civics. There's a separation of powers. One keeps appoints individuals, another can keep the others accountable. So you start to see this and start thinking about this. And this is really important. When you talk about history, you have to think about, okay, what were they thinking? Was this the right plan? You start to think about it, you start to plan about it, and then you got to act and then really review if that works. And so you can put in the chat. Thank you for everyone who's commented. I think that's really a great way to think about history. Is not to think, oh, this happened, but was this the right way? What would you have done differently? Again, everything is great now that we know a bit more about, oh, maybe this could have been done differently. But you just think about it, and start thinking about that. So continue putting in the chat. Just being mindful on time. I want to get through the slides, but I'm really glad everyone's kind of thinking about it and planning. And so we'll shift to 1992, and we start to see these acts. And one of the things our office and certain other individuals and commissions at this time was like, we need to change our government. And they proposed actually a Government Reform Act of 1992. It introduced changing the language of the governing body. And this is really like revolutionary. It's like, okay, we're giving power to the people, but council says, hey, wait, let's table it. That's too much. So actually, we see this being tabled, and we actually see our Office of Navajo Government Development and Commission actually get their budget slashed. So just imagine, you have this task of creating recommendations, and you recommend something, but they're like, no, that's too much. And then the next year your budget gets slashed. It's kind of scary. You start to think about, okay, how are these certain things and projects going to work? If you work for a government entity, you start worrying about your budget. That's questionable. So, and then a couple of years later, one of the big things is LGA. So going back to chapters, they're starting to have these conversations. What should chapters be and represent? And so Local Governance Act, or LGA, is the creation of Title 26 of the Navajo Nation Code. And this was signed by the president, Thomas Atsidi, at the time. And it gives chapters a certification process that is still in place today. There's some amendments. And the idea is that chapters have these authorities, that they can become certified chapters, that they can have certain abilities of leasing and whatnot. Again, still within council, creating regulations and certain policies. And so, but really starting to recognize that chapters are part of our governance, and this is a historic part, and this is where a lot of the governance of chapters comes from. It's Title 26. And so just a couple of years later, 2002, there's two big things in terms of government creating and working. we actually see the amendment of Title I to recognize fundamental law of the Navajo. And so this is really important because these are the laws that Navajos are recognizing. Again, it enters a bigger conversation, which we don't have time to talk about today, but including peacemaking, court system, understanding Navajo common law. And so in 2002, there's a Navajo Nation Council resolution recognizing that. And this is a big part of our history and things that we want to highlight. And actually, the same year, there was a huge reform convention. And so when you hear Red Rock State Convention, they allowed individuals from all these communities to send representatives and to talk about proposed amendments to include government. So not government officials, but rather people from the community. What do you want to change? And so they actually proposed 26 amendments to the current Navajo Nation. And they said, these are things that need to occur, and including that is the governing body to move it from the council to the people. And most of these amendments, when they handed it over to council, never got far. It never went past beyond the committees. Again, during this time, we have 88 delegates. And so there's all these different committees, more so than today. And so a lot of them never get past of them, including different things in terms of reform, in terms of changing the government. And then, so this is kind of our case study today. So I wanted to give some time for it. But we actually have an interesting dispute between branches. So first off, we have President Joe Shirley representing the executive branch, and he creates this task force. And they said, we're going to have two initiatives. Initiatives are where the people create enough signatures and send it to the people for a vote. It's not led by one branch or whatnot. It's led by the people. But in this case, the executive, President Joe Shirley, says, people want this. So he proposes two initiatives. One is to reduce the council from 88 members to 24 members. Quick side note, in 2000, they did an actual referendum for that. It goes through a certain process and actually gets to the people. But because it needs a supermajority, which is something really technical about having all the chapters have resolutions to support it, it's just such an impossibility that process kind of died out 8 years before this. And so he comes back to that. And the second part is he creates presidential line item veto specifically for budgeting. So I forgot to put that on that note. But anyways, he creates this presidential task force to say, all right, we're going to focus on these two changes and collect signatures. And so during that same time, just a couple months later, we have the Navajo Nation Council, so the legislative branch. And they actually have a vote to place President Shirley, the executive branch, on leave, pending an investigation on his involvement with an onset and BSDC business dealing. So you start to have the legislative, hey, wait, before you do any of this, we're going to investigate you. So, and then from there, during this task force, you only have so many days to get enough signatures. They actually collect 18,638 signatures from registered Navajo voters. But the Navajo Election Administrative, which is under the legislative branch, said, hey, wait, only 14,000 of those were acceptable. So you don't meet the threshold, which is really high, 16,530 signatures, which is 15% of registered voters, which on a quick other side note, is the highest that we've ever seen. Not many places in the U.S. or the world have that initiative threshold, but they managed to reach it. And but then it creates this huge controversy. They say, wait, some of these signatures aren't complete. Some of them are signing in the wrong place. Some of them, what have you. And so there's this huge debate between the executive and legislative. And so then the Office of Hearing and Peers kind of goes in there, has this conversation, and they reverse that determination of the insufficiency for both initiatives. And they say, hey, wait, these signatures are valid. They meet the threshold, so it's going to go to an election. So a special election was held. And this is where people go out and vote on December 15th, 2009, not a typical election process, but a special election. So people in both decisions voted in favor of reducing the council from 88 delegates to 24 delegates. The presidential line item goes over line item veto over specifics in the annual budget by council. So it's creating a checks and balance on council. And so this is disputed. You would imagine council say, hey, wait, it's too much, And you actually have the Supreme Court, the third branch, kind of go in between the executive and legislative, right? And this third branch like, hey, wait, we need to review this. We need to have this. So there's actual process. And a couple months later, they upheld the special election. They said the election was valid, and the challenges from council are not there. And so the 24-member council will be sworn in to January 11th, 2011. And the president now has had line item veto authority now. And they said, hey, and any way council was going to say, hey, no, we're going to get rid of that initiative and referendum, they could have, according to Navajo Nation code, by 3/3 vote. But the Supreme Court says you cannot do that. This is the people's vote. And so then it restored, even our office and commission at the time was not fully funded. The commission was dissolved. The office was under the speaker. There's all this different turmoil, which is a whole different presentation. And this kind of the Supreme Court says the Navajo people we have a promise to Navajo people for this Navajo government reform project to create a permanent government, essentially. And so all this happened. Imagine this. This is like 2-3 branches are all involved. They're all having these huge disputes, of checks and balances and power, following 1989. But this is, there's a peaceful transfer. There's no riot, and so the question is, do you think this was the right course of action? Considering 3-branch government creating this and having that checks and balances, and so without like a physical riot or fight, and so do you think this was the right course of action? And so considering that all of this happened, even the reduction of council, a lot of that was created to reduce the funding and the need for 88 delegates. But there's a lot of things. 2020, a couple of years ago, we can think about, okay, maybe this happened, maybe this could have been differently. So, we just want to be reflective of, was this the right course of action? And so even during this time, the interesting thing is, a couple of years later, we had the 5th constitution attempt. And so this is a constitution that builds upon the existing Navajo government, saying like, okay, we like this certain features of the current temporary government. And the preamble acknowledges the Treaty of 1868, acknowledges the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, kind of this international document. And then, but really, it's kind of like this, the authors of this attempt are unknown. It's on our website. But the drafted version was never acted upon, kind of like, okay, we drafted it, but it just kind of goes, okay, silent, And so this is during that same point. And then the next 3 years later, there's another attempt building off of that 2013 draft, saying these are the articles on collective rights of the Navajo people, assembly of chapters. So kind of thinking about how they're going to start incorporating chapters more instead of just 110 individual chapters. And then even including an elders council. So again, this was never acted upon, but this is like these concepts. And you start to see these constitutional attempts kind of change with time. Originally it kind of went from a lot of BIA to kind of thinking more how we can include Navajo, how we can avoid these turmoils and controversies and infighting, and start to build upon even the global perspective. So these are really important when you're talking about constitution attempts. And this is a real high level of our current governance. We had some students want to join or get videos later. And this is a really insightful way of seeing our current government, from a big point of view in terms of 3 branches. We're talking to legislative that creates the laws. We have the speaker. And when we say branch chiefs, we have 3 branch chiefs right now, which are the speaker, the president, and chief justice, individuals that are kind of representing these branches. But the speaker being appointed by the Navajo Nation Council, and our 5 committees today represented by the council and those membership. Again, there used to be 88 delegates here, and there used to be more committees. And then the legislative offices, which includes ours as a kind of a quasi-independent. And this is where you start to see Office of Legislative Services, Legal Counsel, Auditor General, Ethics and Rules, Elections, labor. And so you start to see these branches, and it kind of shifts to the executive, which is implementing the law, which a lot of people, the executive is the biggest branch by far in terms of employment, in terms of employees, and also in terms of budget. These are individuals you'll see on the community, the various divisions and departments and offices. And so this is built with the president and vice president and their administration, their cabinet level, which are the division heads of these departments and divisions. And so they're playing a role of like executing the laws in different ways. And this is definitely the biggest branch. And then judicial, which is interpreting the law, which is this kind of like, the third branch that can play the role, Chief Justice, associate judges. And you kind of have their order, Supreme Court, district courts, family courts. And then peacemaking, which is really amazing. When I talk to other tribes, like, wow, you guys actually have a way to incorporate your culture into your lawmaking, or not your lawmaking, but interpreting the laws, and you guys don't just follow the US. There's an option to incorporate your culture and traditions. And so this is really amazing. I just want to highlight that. But we have all these district courts in the different regions serving our Navajo people. Again, Navajo Nation is very large, and when you think about it. And then you start to see we have 110 chapters, and wow, so amazing. All of them have their own type of history and culture. And like we said, it started off with Loop in 1927, but it's evolved to this point. Excuse me. And so we start to see the role of chapters. And as mentioned before, not all of them are governed the same way. We actually have LGA, Local Governance Act certified chapters, and so they have their own specific policies following Title 26. And this is a map of all the chapters that follow it as far as I know from last year. And so these individual chapters have a different way of governing. Some of them may be having a commission, some of them have a different policies. And so when you talk chapters, all of them are not the same, and that makes them really unique, but also, sometimes makes it difficult if you're Navajo Nation or different divisions saying, oh, and work with this chapter, but some of them are different, and so a lot of them have their own history, and including the satellites, including all the different divisions. And so, that's a real big, broad stroke of Navajo governance, of today, and I hope that's helpful. And so when we think of our timeline, we're at this really big point. We just passed this 100-year centennial of this current temporary Navajo Nation government. It was created a lot by BIA saying you should do this, you should do that. And so thinking into the future, thinking about how we want to govern ourselves, thinking of the consent of Navajo people. Again, the Navajo people never consented to all of these different things, besides voting for people, but they didn't create it, establish it, as much as we consider it. There's always been a role of the US in terms of thinking about it. So thinking into the future, thinking into the future of your children and grandchildren, you start to think, okay, what type of governance do we want? And again, U.S. federal Indian law policy, we're in this self-determination. It's up to us, and as our director says, he doesn't think we're in self-determination. He thinks we're in self-actualization, which means like we can actually do this ourselves. And so, just to shift from U.S. saying, all right, we're going to live with you guys, but wait, we're going to remove you. All right, we're going to include you. All right, no, we're going to reorganize you. And then we're going to terminate some of the tribes. But now, all right, it's back to you. So this is really a historic moment when you think about the history and the broad history of all this. And so I hope that's kind of getting to all of you and thinking about it. And I wanted to include our references. We have our own documents here at the office if you have any questions there. But a lot of this comes from the Navajo Political Experience by David Wilkins, Navajo History, The Land of People by Bill Ackery. And so these are really the references. I wanted to include that. I'm not talking from my own experience. I wasn't born for 100 years. But I wanted to leave with one big question, reflecting on our history, how do you envision our future? And so not thinking about, oh, we should be like this, but just think about all this that happened, think about what our Navajo people had to go through and to think and these creations. And you can start to think, okay, what do we want our grandchildren to govern like, And so you can put it in the chat. We appreciate your comments, and being very thoughtful. And so just to think about it, to reflect. And our government wasn't created overnight. It took 100 years to get to where we're at today, And so, but imagine another 100 years of what you want, we won't all be here, but what do we want for those next generations? So really consider that. And so I know it's 1 o'clock. I just want to thank you for your time. If you have any questions, feel free to email us at navogovdev@gmail.com. Next week, our ONGD Executive Director will be doing a presentation on the central attributes of a democracy. Again, this is a bigger conversation, you know. We went from traditional governance to talking about our current government now, how it was really created not by us, but by other entities, and we've kind of maintained it. And now we start to think about, okay, what do we want to keep? What do we want, or what's important to our governance, you know? And thinking about even what a democracy is in Navajo, and are we democratic? Are we this way, you know? So hopefully this has been a really helpful presentation. Again, Navajo history is really interesting and tells a really fascinating story. And I'm hoping to learn from you as much as I can. If you have any comments or any suggestions, feel free to email us. Our upcoming events, register the link. Tristan will put that on the chat. But thank you for your time, and thank you for your thoughts, your comments. And I hopefully you have a great day in thinking about our government, and not be pessimist, and to think optimistically about our future. Yeah. Although I just want to appreciate everyone that helped with my presentation, from the office staff to my family, and I hope everyone has a good day. Yeah, thank you.